Now that's fast and efficient, but what happens if we leave the case in the resizing die for, let's say, 5 seconds? Well, that is called dwell time, and that is the topic of today's video. In one of our previous videos, one of our viewers, maybe that's you, commented that he uses a 5-second dwell time whenever he's full-length resizing, and he found that that improves the consistency of the final cases. You know, in all honesty, I have never heard of leaving a case inside that resizing die for any length of time, really. 3 seconds, 5 seconds, whatever it happens to be. So I did a little bit of research on that, did some reading, and I did find a number of people who have the same claim, who are saying that they're seeing improved consistency in the final product following a resizing if they're using about a 3 to 6 second dwell time. So that, of course, is really interesting, and as it kind of our way of doing things here on Extreme Reloading, I'm going to put that to the test. And so I have set up an experiment, and let me walk you through the setup of that experiment, the experimental design we're going to be following, and then we're actually going to jump into the resizing test and ultimately look at all of the results. Now, the first thing that I did is I chose 60 cases. 60 cases. 30 of those cases are going to be resized in my normal way of doing things. Run them into the press, run them out of the press, really no dwell time at all. That's probably the technique that the great majority of you are also using. That's what I've been using for years and for decades. I will call that my 0 dwell time set. The other 30 cases will receive a full 5-second dwell time inside the resizing die. All 60 of these cases are head stamped exactly the same. These are Igman 7.62 by 51 308 Winchester brass cases. Now, why did I choose Igman? Well, the simple reason is that is the only brand of case that I have that has a sufficient quantity of once-fired brass cases ready for resizing. I don't have enough Lapua right now. I don't have enough of alpha brass and so on and so forth to do that experiment. A lot of them are loaded and ready to go. So Igman became my de facto default brass that I chose for this experiment. And before I started anything, I wanted to get a feel for what am I getting into with this Igman brass. So I weighed all of those cases, all 60 of those cases, and I found that this brass is extremely variable. I would not consider it anything close to a premium brass, kind of a range brass, no doubt about that. And in fact, in all of the different types of 308 brass that I have tested, this is probably the least consistent brass. It is heavy brass also, and that's because it's 7.62 by 51, which tends to have a thicker case. In fact, the case thickness up at the neck ranges, also highly variable, from 0.144 of an inch all the way to 0.186 roughly of an inch. So highly variable on all ways of measuring this. But that actually works out pretty well, because if I was using some ultra premium brass that's extremely consistent in the first place, then I may not be able to detect an improvement of the dwell time versus 0 dwell time resizing process. So I'm kind of happy of how things are working out right now. It sets up for a very, very good experiment. So I have separated these two batches into 30 case groups, right? And what I'm going to do next is, before any of the resizing starts, I'm going to make a bunch of measurements. I'm going to get overall length. I'm going to measure the headspace dimension on all of these cases, and I'm going to measure the case head expansion. That's the measurement just above the web of the case, very, very close to the base of that case. And we're going to see how these cases change with the two different approaches or methods of resizing. I'm going to keep these cases in the exact same order, so I will be able to compare case number 1 before to case number 1 after. I'm going to have to pay a lot of attention to make sure that I do this absolutely correctly. But I've done stuff like this before. Focusing, paying attention on what I'm doing, I know I can certainly do that and make a really, really good comparison by the time this is all done. So do you follow me? All right, cool. Let me go ahead and get started, and we'll see how this turns out. When resizing, the fired or spent case will be formed to the dimensions of the die. If the case is smaller than the dimensions of the die, that case will oftentimes expand outward to fill the case. Think of it like pouring a liquid, maybe some Jell-O, into a mold, and that liquid is going to fill the mold and follow the shape of that mold. In most instances, the case is going to be larger than the die, and so that case is going to be squished by the die to fill the die and actually to contract the case itself. Now, when that case is squished, let's say, or think of it again like that liquid being poured into a mold, well, that material needs to go somewhere. The brass cannot move downward because it is very effectively blocked by the base of the shell holder and then, of course, the ram itself. No, instead what happens is that case will oftentimes, well, it does grow upward, and it grows in length. This is why I am measuring overall length as part of the 4 measurements I'm making with this experiment. I want to see and measure how that brass case is changing as a result of the resizing process. I'm using a digital caliper and the Hornady anvil base to get a good measurement of overall length. Now, I previously inspected all these cases and I discarded every one that had a bent rim. Now, that's relatively common with these semi-auto rifles like the HK MR762. But one thing I didn't think about ahead of time was that in some instances it's possible that the primer was slightly backed out, and that could, in theory, give me an erroneous reading of overall length for any of those cases, well, during the pre-resizing measurement phase. From what I saw, though, in the actual measurement process, the backed out primer concern was minimal, negligible. I don't think it even happened, but I will throw that out. What I could have done in hindsight is I could have decapped all of those cases first, but I didn't do that. But again, I don't think it was a concern for the cases that I was dealing with. headspace dimension was the next measurement I made on each of these cases. And here again, I used the Hornady flat anvil base and the Hornady Headspace tool. One note about this, however, that I found kind of curious is that the SAMI spec for Headspace is 1.634 inch. That's the max. And as I was making these measurements, pretty much every one of those came in below SAMI spec. So I looked at that a little bit, and I think what is happening is that the Headspace gauge and the bushing that is used for the 308 Winchester, I think it looks like it's actually sitting a little bit too far back up on the shoulder and not sitting at the exact same datum point as identified by SAMI. That ends up giving me a shorter headspace measurement compared to what I would get if I were actually measuring from about that, well, from that center of the shoulder itself. Now that is not a concern though either, because what's really important with this comparison and this experiment is not the actual length of the headspace, pre-resizing or post-resizing, but rather how much shoulder bump or shoulder setback was achieved during the resizing process, and even more importantly, how consistent was that setback with the no-dwell standard resizing process versus the 5-second dwell resizing process. So this method should work just fine, perfectly fine for this particular experiment. The third measurement was neck diameter. Now I'll note that numerous cases pre-resizing were bent. They were bent in one way or the other. Again, that's part of the process, I'm afraid, of extraction out of those semi-auto rifles. Some of the mouths and necks got a little bit bent up. I tried to make the measurement where it was as round as possible, but I will make a note to you so you know that some of these pre-measurements were a little bit off, a little bit odd, simply because numerous cases actually had a bent mouth. The fourth measurement that I made is case head expansion, CHE. Now I decided to make this measurement just in case. I did not want, after the resizing process, to think, I wish I had measured the case head expansion. I do not know how useful that will be, but I went ahead and made that measurement anyway. So we have 4 measurements made on the 30 standard or no dwell cases. That's 120 measurements. I have another 120 measurements on each of those 30 cases that are part of my 5-second dwell subset or group, making a total of 240 measurements pre-resizing. What's more, I was able to keep all of these cases in their correct order. Case number 1, as I placed it in that loading block, this case number 1 for my 5-second dwell is the exact case number 1 through the entire process, including resizing and all the measurements that I made after resizing. So once all those pre-resizing measurements were made, I entered those measurements into an Excel spreadsheet, double-checked all those entries, and because I kept things in the correct order, I could, if I wanted to, go back and pull one of those cases and make another measurement just to confirm that. So that worked out really, really well. A little bit painstaking, but it did work out really, really well. Now here are the results for the pre-resizing measurements. This table gives the summary statistics for the case that will receive the standard or 0 dwell time resizing. And this table gives the summary statistics for the cases that will receive the 5-second dwell time resizing. Let me note again how the cases were separated into these two groups. Remember, I weighed all of these cases and sorted them from lightest to heaviest. And the way I did it is I purposely set it up so that each of these two subsets would have very, very similar case weight distributions. In other words, let's say I had two cases that weighed exactly 185.0 grains. Well, one of those two cases was put into the standard no dwell time set, and the other of those two cases was put into the 5-second dwell time set. And that's what I mean by all of these cases, and both of those sets will have a similar distribution of case weights. Next, I lubed, re-inspected, and then resized these cases. I started with the 0 dwell standard method and then used the 5-second dwell method. The resizing die that I used for all of these was the Reading Competition full-length resizing die with a 0.334 titanium nitride coated bushing. I then wiped down all of these cases, keeping them again in that correct order, and then made another set of these measurements. That is 120 measurements for each subset, total of another 240 measurements. 480 measurements made throughout this entire experiment. Let's take a look at the results. For the standard or no dwell time group, the overall length was quite consistent. Standard deviation of those overall lengths of only 0.03 or 3 thousandths of an inch standard deviation. Now, I'm not concerned with that because it's extremely common, as I noted earlier, for those cases to lengthen or grow in that resizing process. Remember that analogy of pouring a liquid into a mold. So the next step in this whole resizing process, or I should say reloading process and case prep process, is to trim those cases. And we'll bring them right back down into SAMI spec without a problem whatsoever. Very, very standard procedure, as you likely know. Let's look at the Headspace. The Headspace came in plenty below the SAMI spec, and in fact, again, remember what I noted. I think that this measurement with the Hornady Headspace gauge is a little bit, it comes in a little bit on the short side with this particular bushing that was used. But look at the standard deviation. Very uniform to 1/1000th of an inch. Neck diameters came in at 0.335. Now you might be thinking, hold on, you said you used a 0.334 inch neck bushing in that resizing die. What gives? Why is this 335? Well, the cases at the factory were annealed. These cases were then fired. And already, even after one firing, we're starting to see the loss of some of the plasticity of those cases. In other words, we're seeing a little bit of springback, 1/1000th of an inch of springback. If we continue to load and fire these cases repeatedly without another annealing, then we're going to probably see, most likely, more springback each time we resize these cases. Let's take a look at the case head expansion. Extremely uniform. Mean and median are exactly the same like many of our other measurements, and no standard deviation below, it's below 1/1000th of an inch of standard deviation. Now if we look at the 5-second dwell time resized cases, we see overall length very similar to what we had with the standard, but actually a little bit more of variability in that standard deviation. I'm not going to sweat that too much. Headspace, extremely similar. Again, mean and median are the same. Standard deviation, 1/1000th of an inch. Again, just like with the standard no dwell time resizing. Neck diameters, again, 0.335, and absolute consistency as far as we can measure on those standard deviations. And similar stuff again with case head expansion. Kind of turned out not to be a very important measurement to make. I suppose the three more important measurements are the previous ones. Overall length, somewhat interesting to look at. Headspace and shoulder bump or setback, and then of course the neck diameter dimensions. Now let's look closely at the amount of shoulder setback affected by these resizing process in both the 0 dwell time and 5-second dwell time groups. This is actually, I would say this is a tremendous amount of shoulder setback, but it is also very consistent. 1/1000th of an inch difference. A little bit different end result comparing the 0 dwell versus the 5-second dwell time. Not really sure why that happened, but it is. And I'm not so sure we could say, oh, that's because you did the 5-second dwell time or not. I'm not so sure I'm ready to chalk that up to that method. Now, to go back and talk a little bit more about this tremendous sort of aggressive shoulder setback, this is necessary to get these particular cases to cycle absolutely reliable in the HK MR762 rifle, semi-automatic rifle, and so that's why we're seeing this level of shoulder setback. If you watch my previous video, this ends up working beautifully, checks out beautifully in those case gauges, and what's more important is it functions beautifully, perfectly in that rifle with this setting. Some of the earlier settings I was using, a little bit more conservative, a little bit more careful, we'd have the things jam up. So this is what I'm using for this particular rifle. Now, the result of something this aggressive is a shortening of the case life. I realize that, but when you're shooting semi-auto rifles, what's probably going to happen to these cases before I ever have problems because of the stretching and case head separation problems in the future, most likely I will see the rims get all dinged up, messed up during the extraction process, so common that I'll end up having to discard them anyway. So I'm not going to sweat that too much, but I always inspect cases so closely for damaged rims, bent rims, as well as incipient case head fractures by using a feeler on the inside of that case. But did the 5-second dwell time of resizing make these cases more consistent compared to the standard 0 dwell time? No. I see no evidence at all to support that. This seems like it could be one of those instances of what I call reloader's voodoo. What the heck? That was weird. In fact, I feel kind of weird. Well, anyway, I don't know about you, but I'm going to be sticking with my standard 0 dwell time resizing process, but I am interested in your thoughts, your ideas about this video. So feel free to post those in the comments below, and as always, thanks a bunch for watching.